The frost lay thick upon the hedgerows that December morning, transforming the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead into something from a Christmas card. Each blade of grass stood rigid with ice, and the air was so sharp it seemed to ring like crystal when disturbed by footsteps or voices. At 9:30, the winter frost coach, a rather grand name for what was, in truth, the daily motor coach service to London, drew up outside the post office with its customary wheeze and rumble. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her sensible dark coat and carrying a small carpet bag, stood by the low stone wall observing the morning's passengers with the gentle interest that was her hallmark. She was not, strictly speaking, taking the coach herself on this particular morning, but had found it necessary to post a letter to her nephew Raymond, and if that errand happened to coincide with the departure time, well, such coincidences were not uncommon in village life. The passengers gathering for the London run presented an interesting study in human nature, as passengers always did. There was Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, elegantly turned out in a fur-trimmed coat that spoke of better days, clutching a leather handbag with the intensity of someone guarding state secrets. She had moved to St. Mary Mead 3 years ago, following what the village tactfully referred to as unfortunate circumstances in her previous life, though the exact nature of those circumstances remained a matter of considerable speculation. Standing somewhat apart was Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, a distinguished gentleman in his 50s whose weekly journeys to London had become something of a village ritual. He carried himself with the bearing of a professional man, though there was something in his manner this morning, a tension about the eyes, a certain restlessness, that suggested all was not quite as it should be. Miss Victoria Pemberton, pale and ethereal in her simple grey coat, clutched a small suitcase as though it contained her entire worldly possessions. She was governess to the Cholmondeley children, and rarely ventured beyond the village boundaries, making her presence on the London coach all the more noteworthy. Her fingers worried constantly at a silver locket at her throat, and she cast frequent, almost furtive glances at Dr. Hartwell. The fourth passenger was Mr. Alistair Finch, a retired bank manager whose self-importance was exceeded only by his conviction that everyone else's business was somehow his concern. He stood with military precision beside his expensive leather valise, consulting his pocket watch with the air of a man for whom punctuality was a moral virtue. The journey begins. All aboard for London, called Ted Huggins, the driver, a solid, reliable man who had been navigating these lanes for the better part of 20 years. The passengers climbed aboard with the usual mixture of anticipation and mild complaint about the cold. Miss Marple watched as they settled themselves within the coach's interior. Mrs. Ashworth chose a seat by the window, her handbag positioned on her lap like a shield. Mr. Finch established himself near the front with an air of proprietorial satisfaction, while Miss Pemberton took a place toward the back, as far from the others as the confined space would allow. Dr. Hartwell, after a moment's hesitation that Miss Marple found rather telling, seated himself across the aisle from the young governess. As the coach pulled away from St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of the passengers through the frost-touched windows. Even in that brief moment, she observed the subtle dynamics at play. The way Mrs. Ashworth's fingers tightened on her bag when Mr. Finch turned to speak to her, the manner in which Miss Pemberton seemed to shrink into her coat whenever Dr. Hartwell's gaze fell upon her, the curious intensity with which the doctor watched the young woman. Inside the winter frost coach. The interior of the coach was close and warm, filled with the mingled scents of wool, leather, and the faint medicinal smell that always seemed to cling to Dr. Hartwell's person. As the vehicle made its way along the increasingly treacherous roads toward London, the passengers settled into that peculiar mixture of intimacy and formality that characterizes enforced proximity among strangers. Mr. Finch, never one to allow silence to persist when his voice might fill it, began regaling his fellow travelers with observations about the weather, the state of the roads, and the general decline of punctuality in modern life. Mrs. Ashworth responded with the sort of polite murmurs that discouraged further conversation without giving actual offense. Miss Pemberton sat in rigid silence, her pale hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white through the thin leather of her gloves. Dr. Hartwell made several attempts to catch her eye, his expression growing increasingly troubled when she steadfastly refused to acknowledge his presence. "Terrible weather for traveling," Mrs. Ashworth remarked, though whether to break the mounting tension or from genuine concern was unclear. "I do hope the roads don't become impassable." "The coach has never failed to reach London," Mr. Finch declared with characteristic authority, "though I must say the service was far more reliable in my banking days. Standards have declined considerably since the war." Dr. Hartwell shifted in his seat, his medical bag sliding slightly on his lap. "Some things," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on Miss Pemberton, "cannot be avoided, regardless of the weather or the reliability of transport." The young governess went even paler at these words, if such a thing were possible, and her hand flew to the locket at her throat. Mrs. Ashworth glanced sharply between them, her expression suggesting that she had detected undercurrents she had not previously suspected. The discovery. The coach had been travelling for perhaps 40 minutes, when it began to slow for the regular stop at Millfield Crossing. This was where passengers could stretch their legs and take refreshment at the small inn that served both the London and the local routes. "Thank goodness," murmured Mrs. Ashworth. "I could certainly use a cup of tea." Ted Huggins brought the coach to a gentle halt and opened the door, allowing the bitter December air to rush in. 20 minutes, ladies and gentlemen," he called. "Time for refreshment before we continue to London." The passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Mrs. Ashworth was first to rise, followed by Miss Pemberton, who seemed eager to escape the confines of the coach. Dr. Hartwell made as if to follow her, then stopped, his attention caught by something that made him frown. Mr. Finch remained in his seat, his head tilted at an odd angle, his eyes closed. His expensive leather gloves were still folded neatly in his lap, and his pocket watch gleamed dully in the pale winter light filtering through the windows. "Mr. Finch?" Dr. Hartwell called softly. "We've arrived at the crossing, sir." There was no response. Dr. Hartwell leaned forward, his professional instincts engaged. He reached out to touch the man's shoulder, then drew back sharply, his face draining of color. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said in a voice that had gone suddenly hoarse, "I think you had better fetch the landlord from the inn. Quickly, if you please." "Whatever for?" she began, then stopped as she saw his expression. "Dr. Hartwell, what?" "Mr. Finch is dead," he said simply. The words fell into the winter air like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief. Miss Pemberton let out a small strangled cry and clutched at the doorframe for support. Mrs. Ashworth stood frozen, her handbag dangling from nerveless fingers. Ted Huggins, who had been checking the coach's exterior, appeared in the doorway. "What's all this, then?" he began, then saw the tableau within and fell silent. Dr. Hartwell was bending over the motionless figure, his trained eye taking in details that others might miss. After a moment, he straightened, his expression grave. "This was no natural death," he announced quietly. "Mr. Finch has been murdered." The winter frost coach, which had begun its journey as a simple conveyance between village and city, had become something far more sinister, the scene of a carefully planned and executed crime. And somewhere among the shocked and frightened passengers stood a killer who had counted on the isolation of the winter roads and the intimacy of enforced travel to commit the perfect murder. The landlord of the Millfield Arms, George Parrott, stood in the doorway of his establishment with the expression of a man who had awakened to find his quiet world turned upside down. The word murder seemed to echo in the frosty air, transforming his modest inn from a simple way station into something far more sinister. "I'll telephone the police at once," he stammered, his florid face pale with shock. "Inspector Craddock at Much Benham. He'll know what to do." Dr. Hartwell nodded curtly. See that no one disturbs the coach until they arrive. This is now a crime scene." His professional manner had taken complete command, though his eyes kept drifting toward Miss Pemberton, who stood trembling by the inn's entrance. Ted Huggins, the driver, removed his cap and twisted it nervously in his hands. 20 years I've been driving this route," he muttered. Never so much as a harsh word between passengers. How could such a thing happen? Mrs. Ashworth clutched her handbag tighter, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. "We must get inside," she said, her voice brittle with barely controlled hysteria. "Standing about in this cold won't help anyone." The inn's parlor, with its low beams and crackling fire, should have provided comfort, but the knowledge that death had traveled with them cast a pall over everything. Mrs. Parrott, the landlord's wife, bustled about preparing tea with the sort of determined efficiency that emerges in times of crisis. "Poison, you said?" Mrs. Ashworth's voice was barely above a whisper as she accepted a steaming cup. "But how is that possible? We had nothing to eat or drink on the journey." Dr. Hartwell's expression was grave. The symptoms were unmistakable. Something fast-acting, administered recently. The question is when and how. Miss Pemberton sat huddled in the corner chair, her pale fingers still worrying at the silver locket at her throat. She had spoken barely a word since the discovery, but her distress was palpable. When Dr. Hartwell moved toward her with obvious concern, she shrank away with such evident fear that he stopped, his hands falling helplessly to his sides. "The police will want to question each of us," he said quietly. "We must be prepared to account for our movements, our observations of Mr. Finch during the journey." "Observations?" Mrs. Ashworth's voice rose slightly. "What could any of us have observed? We were simply passengers on a coach. This is madness, absolute madness." Meanwhile, in St. Mary Mead, news of the tragedy spread with the swift efficiency that only shocking events possess. Mrs. Bantry, breathless with excitement and horror, hurried across to Miss Marple's cottage, where she found her friend quietly knitting by the fire. "Jane, you'll never believe what's happened," she exclaimed, settling into the familiar armchair without invitation. "Mr. Finch? Murdered on the London coach. Can you imagine such a thing?" Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm. "How very distressing," she murmured. "Poor Mr. Finch. Though I must say, he was rather a man who invited strong opinions." "The police are involved, of course," Mrs. Bantry continued. "Inspector Craddock has gone out to Millfield Crossing. They say it was poison, Jane, on a public coach in broad daylight." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "Most unusual. One would think such a method rather intimate, wouldn't one? Poison suggests someone who knew Mr. Finch's habits quite well." Around the village, speculation ran wild. At the post office, Mrs. Price declared it must have been a robbery gone wrong. The grocer's wife insisted it was clearly a case of mistaken identity. Young Tommy from the garage was certain it was the work of foreign spies, though he couldn't quite explain why they would target a retired bank manager. Miss Marple listened to each theory with her characteristic gentle attention, offering only the occasional "how interesting" or "you don't say." But her mind was already working, sifting through what she knew of the passengers, their relationships, their secrets. She remembered Mrs. Ashworth's desperate grip on her handbag, Dr. Hartwell's troubled attention to Miss Pemberton, the young governess's obvious distress. Mr. Finch, for all his pompous ways, had been a creature of routine. To die on his regular journey suggested something deeply personal, not random violence, but calculated murder. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the frost-covered village, Miss Marple set aside her knitting. The winter frost coach had carried more than passengers that morning. It had carried secrets, fears, and ultimately, death itself. The game, as her nephew Raymond might say, was afoot. Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived at Millfield Crossing with his overcoat dusted in frost and his expression set in professional gravity. A tall man with thoughtful eyes and a methodical manner, he surveyed the scene with the practiced attention of someone who understood that first impressions often proved crucial. The coach stood like a silent monument to the morning's horror, its windows opaque with condensation and its interior now forbidden territory. Dr. Hartwell met him at the coach door, his medical composure intact despite the circumstances. "Inspector, I've disturbed nothing since my initial examination. Mr. Finch appears to have died peacefully, but the symptoms strongly suggest cyanide poisoning, the constricted pupils, the faint, bitter almond scent, the rapidity of onset." Craddock nodded, making careful notes. Inside the coach, the air was stale and redolent of leather and damp wool. Mr. Finch remained exactly as discovered, his expensive gloves folded neatly in his lap, his pocket watch chain arranged with characteristic precision. Death had come with such discretion that he might have been merely dozing. "No signs of struggle, no containers or food remains," Craddock observed, his trained eye cataloguing every detail. "Whatever was administered must have been introduced covertly during the journey. The question is when and how." At the inn, the surviving passengers presented a study in barely controlled tension. Mrs. Ashworth maintained her elegant composure, but her fingers drummed nervously against her teacup. Miss Pemberton remained huddled in the corner chair, her face translucent with shock, while Ted Huggins paced by the window, muttering about 20 years of peaceful journeys. Craddock's interviews revealed telling undercurrents. Mrs. Ashworth recounted the journey with almost too perfect precision, her account of polite conversation and routine observations delivered with the careful control of someone guarding secrets. Her unfortunate circumstances from her previous life suddenly seemed more significant in light of murder. Miss Pemberton's testimony was fragmented, punctuated by tremors and tears. Her constant clutching of the silver locket at her throat had become a focus of suspicious attention. When questioned about her relationship with the other passengers, she avoided Dr. Hartwell's concerned gaze with obvious distress. Dr. Hartwell himself admitted to professional concern for Miss Pemberton's fragile health, but his solicitous attention carried undertones that suggested something deeper than mere medical interest. His account was clinical, yet troubled, particularly when discussing the young governess's obvious distress. Meanwhile, in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself the center of a whirlwind of speculation. Miss Hartnell arrived breathless with theories, while Dr. Haydock stopped by with professional concerns about poison acquisition and administration. "Mr. Finch was always so particular about his routine," Miss Hartnell observed. "Every Tuesday, same seat, same time. Someone knew his habits very well indeed." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked thoughtfully. "Yes, dear, routine can be both a comfort and a vulnerability, though I wonder what took him to London so regularly. His banking days were long behind him." As she listened to each visitor's theories, Miss Marple's mind worked like a gentle but inexorable machine, sifting through village knowledge and human nature. She recalled similar cases from her extensive experience with small-town secrets. The way poison often reflected intimate knowledge of the victim, the manner in which confined spaces could become theaters for long-simmering resentments. The locket troubled her particularly. Why would a young woman cling so desperately to such an object in the face of murder? Was it comfort, talisman, or symbol of something she feared revealing? And Dr. Hartwell's protective attitude toward Miss Pemberton, was it genuine concern or something more possessive? By evening, the winter frost coach had become a puzzle box, its secrets locked away with its victim. The surviving passengers found themselves stranded at the Millfield Arms, the coach sealed as evidence, each harboring their own fears and suspicions. Miss Marple sensed a pattern emerging from the web of human interactions, faint yet discernible, like frost forming on a window pane. The police would focus on forensic evidence and opportunity, but she understood that the real answer lay in the deeper currents of human passion and desperation that had transformed a routine journey into a stage for murder. Inspector Craddock had learned, through years of experience with village mysteries, to welcome Miss Marple's gentle intrusions into his investigations. When she appeared at the Millfield Arms that grey December afternoon, her arrival seemed as natural as the frost forming on the windows, though he suspected her timing was anything but coincidental. "My dear Inspector," she said, settling into a chair by the fire with the apologetic air of someone who feared she might be imposing, "I do hope you won't think me terribly forward, but the village is quite beside itself with speculation. I thought it might be helpful to hear the facts rather than allow imagination to run completely wild." Craddock, who had been planning to consult her anyway, welcomed her presence. Miss Marple possessed an uncanny ability to notice details that escaped more conventional minds, and her understanding of human nature had proven invaluable in previous cases. "The physical evidence is straightforward enough," he explained, consulting his notes. "Mr. Finch died of what appears to be cyanide poisoning, administered sometime during the journey. No obvious containers, no shared food or drink, yet the symptoms are unmistakable. The question is method and opportunity." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently as she absorbed this information. How very puzzling. Cyanide does require rather direct administration, doesn't it? One can hardly slip it into someone's tea without their knowledge, particularly in such close quarters. The inspector nodded grimly. "Precisely the problem. We've interviewed each passenger separately, but their accounts are frustratingly consistent. Polite conversation at the start, then everyone settled into their own activities. No interaction that would allow for poison to change hands." At Craddock's request, Mrs. Parrott brought the passengers in for follow-up questioning. Miss Marple remained by the fire, her manner that of a harmless elderly lady who had wandered into official business and couldn't quite be turned away. Mrs. Ashworth entered first, maintaining her elegant composure despite the strain of the situation. Her answers were precise, almost rehearsed, describing a journey of mundane pleasantries and quiet reading. Yet something in her controlled demeanor suggested depths carefully hidden. "You mentioned Mr. Finch complained of the cold," Craddock observed. "Did he take anything for his discomfort?" "I believe he had some throat lozenges," Mrs. Ashworth replied carefully. "He was always rather particular about such things, the sort of man who carried remedies for every minor ailment." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with mild interest. "How thoughtful of him. I always think it's so important to be prepared. My dear nephew Raymond is just the same, never travels without his little remedies. Though I do hope Mr. Finch's preparations brought him some comfort in his final moments." Something flickered in Mrs. Ashworth's eyes at this gentle observation, though whether it was sympathy or something else entirely was difficult to determine. When Ted Huggins was called in, his testimony proved more revealing. The driver twisted his cap nervously as he recounted the journey, his distress evident in every gesture. "Mr. Finch did seem a bit poorly," he admitted. "Kept coughing, he did, and reaching for them peppermint lozenges of his. Strong smell they had. Could catch it from the driver's seat when the wind was right." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. "Peppermint, you say? How interesting. Such a distinctive scent. I imagine it would quite overpower other aromas." "Aye, that it would," Ted agreed. "Mr. Finch was particular about them lozenges. Never saw him offer one round, mind you. Kept them in a little tin, all neat and proper-like." After Ted departed, Miss Marple sat quietly for several minutes, her expression thoughtful. "Peppermint is such a useful scent," she murmured eventually. "It does tend to mask other odors quite effectively. Rather like the way Mrs. Dollop used to disguise the taste of her liver tonic with peppermint drops, though I'm afraid the medicine remained just as unpleasant underneath." Dr. Hartwell's interview revealed different tensions entirely. His professional composure remained intact, but his concern for Miss Pemberton was palpable, creating an undercurrent of anxiety that hadn't been present in the other testimonies. Miss Pemberton seemed distressed throughout the journey, he admitted. As her physician, I was naturally concerned, but she appeared reluctant to accept assistance. "How long have you been treating Miss Pemberton?" Craddock inquired. "Several months now," Hartwell replied, though his tone suggested the relationship might be more complex than a simple doctor-patient arrangement. "She suffers from a delicate constitution. The stress of her position as governess can be quite overwhelming for someone of her sensitive nature." Miss Marple observed the doctor with her characteristic gentle attention. "Young women in service do face such challenges," she agreed kindly. "The responsibility, the isolation from family. I imagine Miss Pemberton finds great comfort in having someone who understands her difficulties." Dr. Hartwell's response was perhaps more fervent than the comment warranted. "Indeed, she deserves protection from those who would take advantage of her vulnerable position." As evening approached and the interviews concluded, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the intricate web of relationships that had been traveling together that morning. Each passenger carried secrets, fears, and motivations that extended far beyond the simple journey to London. The peppermint lozenges troubled her particularly. Such a personal item, yet one that could easily be tampered with by someone who knew Mr. Finch's habits intimately. The question was not just who had the opportunity, but who possessed the detailed knowledge of his routines that such a method would require. "It's rather like a recipe," she mused to Inspector Craddock as they prepared to leave the inn. "One must know not just the ingredients, but exactly when and how to combine them for the desired effect. This murder required very intimate knowledge indeed." The winter frost coach sat silent in the gathering dusk, its secrets locked away with its victim. But Miss Marple sensed that the key to unlocking those secrets lay not in forensic evidence or alibis, but in understanding the complex human emotions that had transformed a routine journey into the setting for carefully planned murder. The frost had thickened overnight, transforming Millfield Crossing into a crystalline tableau that seemed to mock the dark events of the previous day. Miss Marple arrived at the inn shortly after breakfast, her manner apologetic yet determined, carrying with her the gentle authority that came from decades of observing human nature in all its complexities. Inspector Craddock welcomed her presence with the gratitude of a man who had learned to value unconventional wisdom. "I confess, Miss Marple, that the forensic evidence raises more questions than it answers. The poison was definitely cyanide, but the method of delivery remains frustratingly elusive." Miss Marple settled into her customary chair by the fire, her knitting bag positioned with characteristic precision. "How very puzzling indeed, though I must say, Inspector, that poison often tells us more about the poisoner than the victim. It requires such intimate knowledge, such careful planning." She had spent the early morning hours in quiet observation, noting the subtle dynamics among the stranded passengers. Mrs. Ashworth maintained her elegant composure, but Miss Marple's experienced eye detected the telltale signs of genteel poverty. The carefully mended gloves, the handbag polished to disguise its age, the way her fingers tightened whenever money was mentioned, however casually. Financial desperation, Miss Marple mused to herself, can drive even the most respectable people to extraordinary measures. Rather like poor Mrs. Weatherby, who nearly poisoned herself taking half doses of medicine because she couldn't afford proper treatment. Miss Pemberton presented a different puzzle entirely. Her fear seemed older and deeper than mere shock at witnessing murder. The way she shrank from Dr. Hartwell's solicitous attention suggested secrets that predated yesterday's tragedy. The silver locket at her throat had become almost a talisman, clutched with desperate intensity whenever stress mounted. Dr. Hartwell's protective concern for the young governess carried undertones that intrigued Miss Marple. His professional manner couldn't quite disguise the personal investment in Miss Pemberton's welfare, an investment that seemed to cause him considerable anxiety. When Craddock produced Mr. Finch's personal effects for examination, Miss Marple's attention was immediately drawn to the small silver lozenge tin. She handled it with the reverence due a piece of evidence, but also with the intuitive understanding of someone who recognized the significance of personal habits. "Such a pretty little thing," she observed, turning the tin in the pale winter light. "Mr. Finch was always so particular about his peppermint lozenges. Ted Huggins mentioned their strong scent. Peppermint does tend to mask other odors quite effectively." As she examined the tin more closely, her sharp eyes detected something that had escaped previous notice. Along the edge where the lid met the body was the faintest discoloration, barely perceptible but distinctly different from the surrounding tarnish. When she lifted the tin to her nose, beneath the lingering peppermint was the ghost of something else, an acrid note so faint it might have been imagination. "How interesting," she murmured. "This tiny mark suggests the poison wasn't simply mixed with the lozenges, but applied to the tin itself. Someone who knew Mr. Finch's habits intimately. How he opened the tin, which finger he used, how he handled his little ritual of taking his peppermint." Craddock leaned forward with renewed interest. "You're suggesting the cyanide was on the tin's surface?" "It would explain so much," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "No need to tamper with the lozenges themselves. No risk of detection through taste or smell. Simply a thin coating on the precise spot where Mr. Finch would touch the tin most frequently. Absorbed through the skin, perhaps, or transferred when he inevitably touched his mouth or lips." The implications were chilling in their sophistication. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity, but a methodically planned murder that relied on intimate knowledge of the victim's most personal habits. Later, when Craddock arranged for the passengers to reenact their journey in the coach, Miss Marple positioned herself unobtrusively where she could observe every nuance of behavior. The confined space seemed to intensify the underlying tensions, and she noted how each passenger's reactions revealed layers of complexity beneath their surface composure. Mrs. Ashworth's controlled responses suggested someone accustomed to hiding financial desperation behind social propriety. Miss Pemberton's obvious distress when questioned about her connection to Mr. Finch hinted at complications beyond simple employer-employee relations. Dr. Hartwell's protective intensity toward the young woman carried implications that extended far beyond professional concern. As the winter afternoon darkened, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the intricate web of relationships that had converged on the Winterfrost coach. What had appeared to be a random collection of passengers was revealing itself as a carefully orchestrated drama of human emotions, pushed beyond their breaking points. The most dangerous murders, she reflected to Inspector Craddock as they prepared to leave the inn, are often those that arise from the most ordinary circumstances. Fear, desperation, and secrets have a way of transforming everyday people into something quite different from what they appear. The Winterfrost coach sat silent in the gathering dusk, its secrets partially unveiled but far from fully understood. Miss Marple sensed that the tiny clue on the lozenge tin was merely the beginning of a much larger and more complex truth. The morning brought fresh revelations that cast the Winterfrost coach murder in an entirely different light. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with news that would transform their understanding of what had seemed like a random collection of passengers into something far more sinister and interconnected. New evidence emerges. "Mr. Finch's solicitor has been most illuminating," Craddock began, settling into the familiar chair by Miss Marple's fire. "It appears our victim was a man of more secrets than the village suspected. His will, amended just 3 months ago, contains several surprising bequests, including a substantial sum to Miss Victoria Pemberton." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. "How very interesting. One doesn't typically leave money to casual acquaintances, particularly someone as careful with his finances as Mr. Finch appeared to be." The inspector consulted his notes with growing excitement. "There's more. We've discovered that Mrs. Ashworth was once Mrs. Cordelia Finch, his former sister-in-law. She was married to Alistair Finch's younger brother before that gentleman's bankruptcy and subsequent flight to the colonies. The unfortunate circumstances that brought her to St. Mary Mead were directly connected to financial dealings with our victim. This revelation cast Mrs. Ashworth's elegant composure in a new light. Her careful maintenance of appearances, the way her fingers tightened on her handbag whenever money was mentioned, the controlled responses to questions about her past, all suddenly made perfect sense. Hidden connections revealed. Further investigation into the Millfield Arms yielded additional insights. Mrs. Parrott, the innkeeper's wife, revealed that Mrs. Ashworth had been a regular visitor to the inn over the past several months, always arriving separately from a well-dressed gentleman who matched Mr. Finch's description. These clandestine meetings had involved heated discussions, tears, and what appeared to be desperate pleading. She'd sit in the corner booth, always very proper, but you could see she was under terrible strain, Mrs. Parrott confided. The gentleman would arrive later, and they'd have these intense conversations in whispers. More than once I saw her crying when he left. Miss Marple absorbed this information with her characteristic gentle attention. Financial desperation can drive even the most respectable people to extraordinary measures. Rather like Mrs. Weatherby in our village, who nearly destroyed herself trying to maintain appearances after her husband's business failed. Miss Pemberton's secret. The young governess's story proved even more tragic upon closer examination. When Miss Marple gently encouraged her to reveal the contents of her precious silver locket, the truth emerged in fragments of barely controlled emotion. Miss Pemberton was not merely a governess who had caught Mr. Finch's charitable attention. She was the widow of his nephew, married secretly during the war to a young man who had died in France before his child could be born. Mr. Finch had refused to acknowledge the marriage or provide any support, claiming the ceremony had been invalid. The child had died in infancy, leaving the young woman destitute and forced to work under an assumed name. He said he wanted to make amends, she whispered, her voice breaking. After all these years, he claimed he felt responsible. But I never wanted his money. I only wanted him to acknowledge what he had done to us. The recognition that my husband was his family, that our child had been his great-nephew. Dr. Hartwell's involvement. Dr. Hartwell's protective concern for Miss Pemberton now revealed itself as something deeper and more complex. He had discovered her true identity during a medical consultation and had been quietly working to help her seek justice through legal channels. His weekly presence on the London coach had been part of a careful campaign to pressure Mr. Finch into acknowledging his responsibilities. He was a stubborn, proud man, Dr. Hartwell admitted when pressed. He had convinced himself that his refusal to help was justified, but I had evidence, letters, documents, that proved the marriage was legitimate. I was determined to make him face the truth. The web tightens. As the winter afternoon darkened, the true complexity of relationships aboard the winter frost coach became apparent. What had seemed like coincidence was revealed as a carefully orchestrated convergence of old grievances and desperate circumstances. Mrs. Ashworth, facing financial ruin and dependent on the man who had destroyed her family's fortune. Miss Pemberton, seeking justice for years of denial and suffering. Dr. Hartwell, determined to protect the woman he had come to love from further cruelty. Each passenger had carried more than luggage that morning. They had brought with them years of resentment, desperation, and thwarted justice. The intimate knowledge required to poison Mr. Finch's lozenge tin suddenly seemed less mysterious when viewed through the lens of these long-standing, bitter relationships. Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire as Inspector Craddock prepared to return to Millfield Crossing for what promised to be crucial final interviews. The pattern was becoming clearer, but she sensed that the most dangerous revelation was yet to come. In her experience, the most carefully planned murders often contained within them the seeds of their own exposure, if one knew how to look for them. The winter frost coach had become a crucible where years of injustice and hidden connections had finally reached their explosive conclusion. The snow continued to fall steadily outside the Millfield Arms, each flake adding another layer to the deceptive purity that had settled over the scene of murder. Inside the low-beamed parlor, the atmosphere had grown increasingly charged as Inspector Craddock prepared for what he sensed would be the crucial confrontation. Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm, though her sharp blue eyes missed nothing of the subtle drama unfolding before her. The systematic unraveling. Inspector Craddock had arranged the surviving passengers in a semicircle, each positioned where they could observe the other's reactions. The revelation of their interconnected relationships had transformed what appeared to be a random collection of travelers into something far more sinister. A carefully orchestrated convergence of old grievances and desperate circumstances. "We now understand," Craddock began, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated evidence, "that this was no chance encounter. Each of you had compelling reasons to wish Mr. Finch dead, and each possessed intimate knowledge of his habits. The question is no longer whether one of you committed murder, but which of you possessed both the means and the final desperation to act." Mrs. Ashworth's elegant composure, so carefully maintained throughout the ordeal, finally began to crack under the sustained pressure. Her financial desperation, hidden beneath layers of genteel respectability, emerged in fragments of barely controlled emotion. "You cannot possibly understand what that man cost my family," she said, her voice trembling with years of suppressed rage. "My husband died of shame, Inspector. The humiliation of bankruptcy, the social disgrace, it literally killed him. And Alistair Finch sat in his comfortable house, refusing to acknowledge any responsibility for what his business dealings had wrought." Her story poured out in bitter detail, the clandestine meetings at the inn, the desperate pleading for some form of restitution, the cold dismissal of her family's suffering. Mr. Finch had offered her £20 as if such a pittance could compensate for a lifetime of loss and degradation. Miss Pemberton's hidden anguish. When attention turned to Miss Pemberton, her fragile composure dissolved entirely. The silver locket at her throat contained not merely a photograph, but a letter from Mr. Finch himself, written but never sent, acknowledging the validity of her wartime marriage to his nephew. "He knew," she whispered, her pale fingers clutching the locket with desperate intensity. "He knew all along that my marriage was legitimate, that my baby was his great-nephew. But his pride, his precious family reputation, mattered more than our suffering." The tragedy of her situation became fully apparent. Widowed in the war, left with a child who died in infancy, forced to work under an assumed name because Mr. Finch had publicly denied the marriage's validity. The recent bequest in his will represented not generosity, but a belated acknowledgement of years of cruelty. Dr. Hartwell's protective presence during this testimony was palpable, his medical composure barely containing what appeared to be deep personal investment in her welfare. When pressed about his role in the ongoing disputes, he admitted to having confronted Mr. Finch directly about his unconscionable behavior. The psychological trap. Miss Marple observed these emotional revelations with her characteristic gentle attention, noting not just what was said, but how each person reacted to the other's testimonies. Something in the pattern of responses troubled her, a quality of genuine surprise and horror that seemed inconsistent with premeditated murder. "Inspector," she said quietly during a brief pause, "might I suggest focusing less on who had reason to wish Mr. Finch dead? Clearly, they all did, and more on who possessed the specific knowledge and opportunity to execute such a sophisticated method." The poison application to the lozenge tin required not just familiarity with Mr. Finch's habits, but access to his personal belongings at a moment when tampering could go undetected. It demanded medical knowledge of absorption rates, dosages, and precise application techniques. As Craddock described the technical aspects of the murder method in clinical detail, Miss Marple watched each face with focused intensity. Mrs. Ashworth showed genuine horror at the calculated nature of the crime. Miss Pemberton went even paler, her hand flying to her throat in obvious distress. But it was Dr. Hartwell's reaction that caught her attention most completely. His medical training allowed him to follow the technical description with professional understanding. Yet there was something else in his expression. Not the shock of learning new information, but the wariness of someone whose own thoughts were being described with uncomfortable accuracy. The unexpected revelation. Just as the psychological pressure seemed to reach its peak, George Parrott burst through the parlor door, his face ashen with shock. "Inspector," he gasped. "Urgent telephone call from London. Mr. Finch's solicitor, Mr. Edwin Pinter, he's been found dead in his chambers. They're saying it was a heart attack, but the timing—" The words fell into the room like a physical blow. Mrs. Ashworth's teacup rattled against its saucer. Miss Pemberton let out a small cry of distress. Dr. Hartwell went rigid, his professional mask slipping for the first time since the ordeal began. "This changes everything," Craddock said grimly. 2 deaths, both connected to Mr. Finch's affairs, both occurring at crucial moments. This was never about a single murder. It's about protecting a secret so dangerous that someone is willing to kill repeatedly to keep it hidden. Miss Marple's knitting needles had stopped their gentle rhythm entirely. In her experience, the most carefully planned murders often contained within them the seeds of their own exposure. The killer had just made their first serious mistake, and she sensed that the final revelation was now within reach. The winter frost coach had become the first scene in a larger drama of deception and murder, one that extended far beyond the confines of a simple village mystery into something altogether more sinister and complex. The telephone call from London struck the assembled company like a physical blow, transforming the intimate parlor of the Millfield Arms into something that felt suddenly exposed and dangerous. Inspector Craddock's face grew increasingly grave as he absorbed the details, while Miss Marple set aside her knitting entirely, her sharp blue eyes fixed on the 3 passengers with renewed intensity. The scope of the crime. Revealed. Pinter's chambers were systematically searched, Craddock reported, his voice carrying the weight of terrible implications. Professional work, according to the Metropolitan Police. Specific files removed, valuables left untouched. The safe was opened with expertise, not forced. This was no random burglary. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. The revelation cast the winter frost coach murder in an entirely different light. What had appeared to be a crime of personal revenge was revealing itself as something far more calculated and dangerous, the systematic elimination of anyone who possessed inconvenient knowledge. Mrs. Ashworth's elegant composure, already strained by the morning's revelations, cracked further under this new pressure. 2 deaths, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Both men who knew Alistair's secrets. Someone is ensuring that certain truths never see the light of day. Miss Pemberton clutched her silver locket with desperate intensity, her pale face reflecting a growing understanding of the true scope of the danger they all faced. "Mr. Pinter was going to help establish the legitimacy of my marriage," she said, her voice trembling. "He had found documents that Mr. Finch thought were destroyed. Now, those papers are gone, and he's dead." Miss Marple's gentle interrogation. Miss Marple observed these reactions with her characteristic gentle attention, noting not just what was said, but how each person responded to the mounting pressure. Rising from her chair with the apologetic air of someone who feared she might be overstepping, she approached the group with questions that seemed innocuous, but were precisely calculated to reveal hidden truths. "I've been puzzling over the sophistication of Mr. Finch's murder," she began conversationally, settling back into her chair. Such an intimate knowledge of his habits was required. Not just that he used peppermint lozenges, but exactly how he used them. which finger he employed to open the tin, how he held it, where he touched it most frequently. She watched each face carefully as she spoke, her manner that of a kindly elderly lady trying to understand a complex situation. It suggests someone who had observed him very closely over an extended period, or perhaps someone with professional knowledge of how such substances might be administered most effectively. Dr. Hartwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his medical composure beginning to show signs of strain. Many people in the village observed Finch's routines over the years, he said, though his voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been present in his earlier testimony. He wasn't secretive about his habits. "Oh, quite so," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "But there's casual observation, and then there's the sort of detailed knowledge that would allow someone to apply poison to precisely the right spot for maximum absorption. That level of expertise suggests medical training, wouldn't you say? The psychological pressure mounts." The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly charged as Miss Marple continued her gentle but relentless questioning. Her approach was masterful in its subtlety, each inquiry building upon the last, creating a web of implications without direct accusation. "The timing has been troubling me as well," she mused, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. If Mr. Finch died from poison absorbed through his skin, why the delay in effect? Cyanide is normally quite rapid in its action, yet he survived for some time after boarding the coach. She paused, allowing the implications to settle, unless, of course, the poison was prepared in a form designed for controlled release. A medical preparation, perhaps, available only to someone with access to pharmaceutical supplies and the knowledge to compound such substances. Dr. Hartwell's professional mask was beginning to crack under the sustained pressure. His hands, usually steady from years of medical practice, showed a slight tremor as he reached for his teacup. "Any reasonably educated person might research such methods," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Miss Marple conceded, gently, "though I wonder about access to the materials. Cyanide compounds suitable for transdermal absorption aren't typically available to the general public. One would need professional connections, wouldn't one? Medical suppliers, pharmaceutical contacts, that sort of thing." The net tightens. As the winter afternoon darkened outside the frost-covered windows, Miss Marple's questioning grew more pointed while maintaining its deceptively gentle tone. She had identified her primary suspect through careful observation of reactions and responses, and now she began to focus her attention with laser-like precision. "Dr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying a new note of quiet authority. "You've been most helpful in explaining the medical aspects of this case. Your immediate recognition of cyanide poisoning was quite remarkable. So confident, so precise, almost as if you knew exactly what to look for." The doctor's face had gone pale, but he maintained his professional demeanor with obvious effort. "Medical training teaches one to recognize the signs of various toxins, Miss Marple. The symptoms were quite characteristic." "Indeed," she replied thoughtfully. "And your weekly journeys to London on the winter frost coach would have provided ample opportunity to observe Mr. Finch's habits in detail, the way he handled his possessions, his little rituals and routines. Such valuable knowledge for someone planning a very specific type of crime." The silence that followed was brittle with tension. Outside, the wind howled around the inn's ancient timbers, while inside, the weight of accusation hung heavy in the air, despite Miss Marple's gentle manner. The final pieces fall into place. Miss Marple's final observation carried the quiet certainty of someone who had solved a complex puzzle through careful attention to human nature. The most telling aspect, I think, is the systematic nature of these crimes. First Mr. Finch, then Mr. Pinter when he became a threat to the killer's security. This suggests not a crime of passion, but a calculated campaign to protect a secret. Or perhaps to protect someone the killer cares deeply about. Her gaze moved meaningfully toward Miss Pemberton, then back to Dr. Hartwell. "Sometimes, Doctor, the greatest crimes are committed not from hatred, but from misguided love. The desire to protect someone from further suffering can drive even the most honorable people to extraordinary measures. Dr. Hartwell's composure finally began to crumble under the weight of her gentle but inexorable logic. His hands trembled as he set down his teacup, and something desperate flickered in his eyes, the look of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. The winter frost coach had indeed carried a killer that morning, but not the obvious suspect driven by personal revenge. Instead, it had transported a man whose professional knowledge and misguided sense of justice had led him down a path of escalating violence, each murder justified in his mind as protection for the woman he had come to love. Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap, knowing that the final revelation was now within reach. The psychological trap had been set with characteristic subtlety, and Dr. Hartwell's reactions had confirmed what her careful observation had already suggested. The game, as her nephew Raymond might say, was nearly over. The silence that followed Miss Marple's gentle but devastating observations stretched through the parlor of the Millfield Arms like a taut wire ready to snap. Dr. Hartwell sat rigid in his chair, his professional composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of her inexorable logic. The winter wind rattled the frost-covered windows, while inside, the accumulated pressure of truth hung heavy in the air, despite the warmth from the crackling fire. The final psychological trap. Inspector Craddock had learned through years of experience to trust Miss Marple's instincts completely, but even he was unprepared for the surgical precision of her psychological approach. She had identified not just the killer, but the complex emotional motivations that had driven a respected physician to commit murder. Her gentle questioning had created a web from which there could be no escape. "Dr. Hartwell," she continued, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from absolute certainty, "you've been most protective of Miss Pemberton throughout this ordeal. Such genuine concern, such determination to shield her from further suffering. It speaks well of your character, though I fear it has led you down a most dangerous path." The doctor's hands trembled as they moved unconsciously toward his medical bag, a gesture so automatic it seemed beyond conscious control. Miss Pemberton watched him with growing horror, her pale face reflecting the dawning realization of what his protection had truly cost. "The timing of your relationship with Miss Pemberton is particularly significant," Miss Marple observed, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "You discovered her true identity during a medical consultation, learned of the injustices she had suffered, and felt compelled to act on her behalf. Such noble intentions, yet so tragically misguided." The confession begins. Dr. Hartwell's professional mask was disintegrating entirely now, revealing the desperate man beneath. His shoulders sagged as if a tremendous weight had finally become too much to bear. "She had suffered enough," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Years of denial, poverty, humiliation, all because of Finch's stubborn pride and cruelty. Someone had to make him acknowledge what he had done." Miss Marple nodded with gentle understanding, though her eyes remained sharp with purpose. "Your medical knowledge made the perfect weapon readily available. The cyanide compound, prepared for transdermal absorption and applied to the precise spot on Mr. Finch's lozenge tin where his fingers would make contact most frequently. Such sophisticated planning, such intimate knowledge of both chemistry and human behavior." The revelation of the method sent a chill through the assembled company. Mrs. Ashworth pressed her handkerchief to her lips in horror, while Miss Pemberton began to weep silent tears of anguish and betrayal. "You observed his routines during your weekly journeys to London," Miss Marple continued relentlessly. "The way he handled his possessions, his little rituals with the peppermint lozenges. You knew exactly how to ensure the poison would be absorbed at the optimal rate, fast enough to be effective, yet delayed enough to avoid immediate suspicion. The complete truth emerges." Dr. Hartwell's confession, when it finally came, emerged in broken fragments of barely controlled emotion. I coated the interior rim of his lozenge tin with a specially prepared cyanide compound, he admitted, his voice cracking with strain. I knew exactly how he opened it, always with his right thumb, always touching the same spot. The compound was designed for slow absorption through the skin, masked by the peppermint scent of his lozenges. The technical precision of the murder was chilling in its calculated nature. This was not a crime of passion, but a methodically planned execution that relied on intimate knowledge of the victim's most personal habits. He was going to change his will again, Dr. Hartwell continued, his professional composure completely abandoned now. Pinter had convinced him to acknowledge Victoria's marriage, but only to reduce the bequest significantly. He wanted to give her just enough to salve his conscience while maintaining his precious family reputation. The cruelty of it was unbearable. The second murder revealed. The full scope of Dr. Hartwell's crimes became apparent as his story unfolded. Mr. Pinter's death represented a more desperate measure when the solicitor became suspicious about the timing of his client's demise and began asking uncomfortable questions. Pinter had copies of documents that proved Victoria's legitimacy, Dr. Hartwell explained, his voice hollow with exhaustion. But he was also growing suspicious about the circumstances of Finch's death. He was asking questions about the poison, making connections I couldn't allow him to pursue. I went to his chambers under the pretense of discussing Victoria's case, but I administered a fast-acting cardiac stimulant that mimicked a natural heart attack. Miss Pemberton's anguish was palpable as she realized the full extent of what had been done in her name. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice breaking with grief and horror. "I would have lived with the injustice rather than have blood on my conscience. How could you think I would want such protection?" The tragic delusion. The doctor's response revealed the tragic delusion that had driven him to murder. "You deserved justice, Victoria. You deserved recognition and compensation for what you had suffered. If the law couldn't provide it, if Finch's conscience wouldn't compel it, then someone had to act. Every night I saw your pain, your struggle to maintain dignity while that monster lived in comfort built on your family's ruin." Miss Marple watched this emotional collapse with a compassionate understanding of someone who had witnessed many such tragedies. "The most dangerous crimes," she observed quietly, "are often those committed from the noblest motives. Love, justice, protection. Such powerful emotions can drive even good people to terrible acts when they lose sight of moral boundaries." The final reckoning. Dr. Hartwell's final admission came with the broken dignity of a man who had sacrificed everything for misguided love. "I thought I could protect her from further cruelty, ensure she received what was rightfully hers without having to endure more public humiliation. But every step led to another, each crime necessitating the next to maintain the deception. I became the very monster I sought to defeat." Inspector Craddock moved forward with professional efficiency, though his expression showed genuine regret for the tragedy that had unfolded. "Dr. Geoffrey Hartwell, I arrest you for the murders of Alistair Finch and Edwin Pinter. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Dr. Hartwell's shoulders sagged with the weight of his confession. Miss Pemberton wept openly, her grief encompassing not just the horror of the crimes, but the loss of the man she had begun to trust, and perhaps even love. "I'm sorry, Victoria," he said as Inspector Craddock prepared to escort him away. "I thought I was saving you from further suffering. Instead, I've caused you the greatest pain of all." The aftermath of truth. The winter frost coach murder had been solved, but the victory felt hollow in the face of such human tragedy. Dr. Hartwell's misguided love had transformed him from healer to killer, his noble intentions corrupted by the very emotions that had initially driven him to help. Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire as the drama reached its conclusion, her gentle wisdom having once again penetrated the complex web of human motivation and deception. The truth had been revealed, but at a cost that would haunt all involved for years to come. The most carefully planned murders, she reflected, often contained within them the seeds of their own exposure, not through forensic evidence or alibis, but through the fundamental human inability to escape the consequences of our deepest emotions, no matter how well-intentioned they might initially appear. The grey December afternoon cast long shadows across the frost-covered landscape as Dr. Hartwell was led away in handcuffs, his professional dignity maintained even in defeat. Miss Pemberton remained huddled in her chair, her sobs echoing in the sudden stillness of the Millfield Arms parlor. The revelation that such calculated murder had been committed in her name seemed to crush her fragile spirit entirely. "I would have lived with the injustice," she whispered through her tears, clutching the silver locket that had become a symbol of unintended tragedy rather than cherished memory. A lifetime of poverty would have been preferable to this horror. Mrs. Ashworth, despite her own grievances against the deceased, showed genuine compassion for the younger woman's plight. The elegant composure she had maintained throughout the ordeal now seemed fragile, stripped bare by the raw emotions of the past hours. The return to village life. News of Dr. Hartwell's arrest reached St. Mary Mead with the swift efficiency that only shocking events possess. When Miss Marple arrived at her cottage that evening, Mrs. Bantry was already waiting, breathless with horror and fascination. "So it was Hartwell all along," she exclaimed, settling into her familiar armchair. "Our very own village doctor, poisoning people with scientific precision. It's positively modern, Jane, quite frightfully psychological." Miss Marple, resuming her place by the fire with her knitting, responded with characteristic gentleness. "Yes, dear, a most tragic case. Quite as tragic for Dr. Hartwell as for the poor gentleman he killed." "Tragic," Mrs. Bantry repeated, somewhat scandalized. "My dear Jane, he murdered 2 men. One hardly calls that merely tragic." "Oh, certainly wicked," Miss Marple agreed placidly. "Deeply wicked. But wickedness does not preclude tragedy. When people persuade themselves that their conscience requires them to do something wrong for a supposed right end, well, that is when matters get quite out of hand. Justice and resolution. Inspector Craddock brought welcome news within the week. Mr. Pinter had been more cautious than Dr. Hartwell realized. Copies of the crucial documents had been lodged with another firm. Miss Pemberton's marriage would be formally recognized, and Mr. Finch's amended will would stand. The legal system, despite the tragedy that had surrounded it, would finally provide the justice that had been so long denied. Mrs. Ashworth, too, would receive some measure of compensation. The estate's executors, perhaps wary of further scrutiny into Mr. Finch's past business dealings, arranged a discretionary settlement that would allow her to maintain her small house in reasonable comfort. The trial, when it came, attracted considerable attention in the county papers. Journalists wrote sensationally of "the poison doctor" and "murder by science," though they made little mention of Miss Marple's crucial role in solving the case. Dr. Hartwell conducted himself with dignity throughout the proceedings, accepting his sentence with the resigned air of a man who had sacrificed everything for misguided love. New beginnings and quiet endings. Miss Pemberton left St. Mary Mead shortly after the trial, taking a small flat in Bath where a distant cousin kept a boarding house. Before her departure, she visited Miss Marple one final time. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply. "Not for what happened to Dr. Hartwell, I don't know if I shall ever think of that clearly, but for making sure the truth was known. I believe that if we live too long with lies, we start to forget who we are." Mrs. Ashworth remained in the village, though quieter than before. The settlement allowed her to maintain her dignity without the constant terror of unpaid bills, though she could never quite forget that it had taken 2 deaths to achieve what should have been done decently years ago. Life in St. Mary Mead resumed its usual rhythm with extraordinary speed. Ted Huggins drove the Winterfrost coach again the following week, his manner subdued, but his timetable as punctual as ever. Only once did he remark on the matter to Miss Marple, "Never thought I'd see murder on my coach, Miss Marple. Can't help feeling as though I'd let something nasty in." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Oh no, Ted. The rest those poor people brought with them in their own hearts and minds." The eternal pattern. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of human emotions that had led to such tragedy. The most dangerous criminals, she had observed, were often those who believed most fervently in the righteousness of their cause. Dr. Hartwell's genuine conviction that he was serving justice had made him far more dangerous than any common murderer motivated by simple greed or hatred. The winter frost coach continued its daily journeys, carrying clerks and shoppers and harmless parcels as it always had. But Miss Marple understood that beneath the calm surface of ordinary life, the potential for both kindness and cruelty lay side by side in every human heart, as close and perilously mingled as threads in her knitting basket. And if, on some future morning, she happened to observe the passengers boarding the London coach, no one would think anything of it. "Just Miss Marple," they would say, watching the world go by, as indeed she was, with her gentle wisdom and unwavering understanding of the eternal complexities of human nature. Spring came tentatively to St. Mary Mead that year, as if the season itself hesitated before softening the harsh edges left by winter's grim work. The frost that had witnessed such calculated evil gradually retreated, replaced by tentative green shoots and the gentle warmth of April sunshine. Yet beneath the village's returning tranquility lay subtle changes, an almost imperceptible shift in the collective consciousness that spoke of innocence lost and hard truths learned. Miss Marple observed these changes from her cottage window with the gentle attention that had served her so well in unraveling the winter frost coach mystery. Mrs. Bantry, for all her initial excitement about having their very own poison doctor, now spoke of the case with genuine solemnity. The comfortable assumption that evil was easily recognizable had been thoroughly shattered, leaving villagers to scrutinize familiar faces with uncomfortable new awareness. Letters arrived regularly from Bath, where Miss Pemberton had found employment with a respectable family. Her careful script revealed a gradual healing that was both physical and emotional. "I sleep peacefully now," she wrote, "though I still struggle to reconcile the man who sought to protect me with the one who committed such terrible acts. The children I teach are delightful, and their parents treat me with genuine respect. Such a contrast to my previous circumstances." The legal recognition of her wartime marriage and the modest inheritance had provided security, but more importantly, the public acknowledgement of past injustices seemed to have lifted a weight she had carried for years. Miss Marple's gentle replies reminded the young woman that understanding others' motivations was not the same as condoning their actions, and that forgiveness was ultimately a gift one gave to oneself. Mrs. Ashworth remained in the village, though transformed by her experience. The financial settlement from Mr. Finch's estate had eliminated the daily terror of unpaid bills, allowing her to abandon the exhausting pretense of maintaining appearances on nothing. She had taken to visiting the elderly and infirm, her natural dignity now employed in genuine service, rather than desperate concealment. When she encountered Miss Marple in the High Street, her carefully guarded eyes showed a new peace, though shadows of the past remained. Dr. Haydock, who had assumed Dr. Hartwell's practice, confided to Miss Marple his concerns about the village's psychological state. "There's something particularly disturbing about discovering that someone you trusted implicitly was capable of such methodical deception," he observed over tea. "It makes people question everything they thought reliable." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm. "Human nature remains remarkably consistent, dear, even in its capacity for surprise. The most dangerous criminals are often those who believe most fervently in the righteousness of their cause." Dr. Hartwell's genuine conviction that he was serving justice made him far more dangerous than any common murderer motivated by simple greed. Inspector Craddock's periodic visits provided professional perspective on the case's resolution. I initially focused too heavily on the obvious motives, he admitted during one such conversation. Mrs. Ashworth's financial desperation, Miss Pemberton's desire for recognition, both seemed more compelling than protective instincts gone wrong. The transformation from healer to killer, Miss Marple replied gently, illustrates the dangerous path that can be traveled when good intentions become divorced from moral restraint. Dr. Hartwell began as a good man who allowed himself one very bad exception, telling himself the rules might be bent for a higher purpose. But once one makes that exception, it becomes easier to do so again. Ted Huggins had returned to his regular route with characteristic resilience, though he admitted to paying closer attention to his passengers. "Can't let one bad morning spoil 20 years of good service," he told Miss Marple, "though I must say the experience has made me more aware of the currents running beneath ordinary conversations." The winter frost coach itself, thoroughly cleaned and refurbished, had resumed its daily journeys carrying clerks, shoppers, and harmless parcels as it always had. Yet for those who knew its history, it remained something more, a reminder that murder often grew not from melodrama, but from the accumulated pressure of ordinary griefs and misguided love. As summer approached and the memory of that frost-covered December morning began to fade into village lore, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the eternal complexities of human nature that had made the case both tragic and fascinating. The coach had carried more than passengers that morning. It had transported years of injustice, desperate love, and misguided righteousness to their inevitable explosive conclusion. In her quiet cottage, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of village life, Miss Marple continued her gentle observation of human nature in all its contradictory complexity. The winter frost coach murders had ended, but the eternal mystery of what drives people to both great kindness and terrible cruelty continued to unfold in countless small dramas throughout St. Mary Mead and beyond. Life, she understood, was rarely as obliging as her knitting patterns. Yet sometimes, in an untidy and painful way, things did come right as circumstances and human frailty allowed. The anniversary of the winter frost coach murders arrived with the same crystalline December morning that had witnessed such calculated evil 12 months before. Miss Marple stood by her cottage window, watching frost patterns form on the glass with the same delicate precision that had characterized her unraveling of Dr. Hartwell's carefully laid plans. The familiar sight reminded her that some things in nature, like certain aspects of human behavior, followed patterns as predictable as they were beautiful, and sometimes as dangerous. The healing of lives. A letter from Bath had arrived that morning, written in Miss Pemberton's increasingly confident hand. "I have accepted a permanent position as companion to Mrs. Weatherby, a cultured elderly lady whose grandchildren visit frequently," she wrote. "I find myself able to speak of my late husband without tears now, and even to remember the brief happiness we shared before his death. The shadow of recent events grows lighter with time, though I shall never forget the terrible price that was paid for justice I never sought." The transformation evident in her correspondence over the months had been remarkable to witness. The frightened woman who had clutched her silver locket with such desperate intensity had gradually emerged as someone capable of genuine peace. Miss Marple's gentle replies throughout the year had helped guide her toward understanding that accepting the benefits of Dr. Hartwell's crimes did not make her complicit in them, a distinction that had taken considerable time for the young woman to accept. Mrs. Ashworth had found her own form of redemption through service to others. The modest settlement from Mr. Finch's estate had eliminated the daily terror of unpaid bills, but more importantly, it had allowed her to abandon the exhausting pretense of maintaining appearances on nothing. She now devoted herself to visiting the village's elderly and infirm, her natural dignity employed in genuine service rather than desperate concealment. When she encountered Miss Marple that December morning, Her greeting carried the warmth of genuine friendship rather than the careful politeness of someone guarding secrets. "I've been thinking about responsibility," she said, adjusting her muffler against the cold. "About how easy it is to blame others entirely for our misfortunes. My brother-in-law behaved abominably, but I see now that building my whole life around resentment did me no good at all. It nearly made me capable of, well, let us say I understand more than I like to admit, how someone like Dr. Hartwell might convince himself of dreadful things." The village's subtle transformation. St. Mary Mead had settled back into its comfortable rhythms with remarkable resilience, though subtle changes remained visible to those who knew how to look. Mrs. Bantry still referred occasionally to our poison doctor when crime appeared in the newspapers, though now with genuine unease rather than thrilled speculation. The comfortable assumption that evil was easily recognizable had been thoroughly shattered, leaving villagers to scrutinize familiar faces with uncomfortable new awareness. Ted Huggins continued driving the winter frost coach with characteristic reliability, though he admitted to paying closer attention to passenger dynamics. 21 years I've been driving this route," he told Miss Marple, "and I've learned that people carry more baggage than what fits in the luggage compartment. Can't let one bad morning spoil decades of good service, but the experience has made me more aware of the currents running beneath ordinary conversations." Dr. Haydock, who had assumed Dr. Hartwell's practice, confided his concerns about the village's psychological state. "There's something particularly disturbing about discovering that someone you trusted implicitly was capable of such methodical deception. It makes people question everything they thought reliable." News from prison. Inspector Craddock's periodic visits provided updates on Dr. Hartwell's situation. The prison chaplain had written to inform Miss Marple that the former doctor spent his days working in the prison hospital, his medical skills now employed in genuine healing rather than calculated harm. "He speaks often of Miss Pemberton with deep regret for the pain his misguided protection caused her," the chaplain noted. "The transformation from someone who believed he was serving justice to someone who understands the magnitude of his crimes has been profound to witness." The case had influenced Craddock's approach to subsequent investigations as well. "I pay closer attention now to the relationships between victims and potential suspects," he explained during one visit. "The most dangerous criminals are often those whose motives appear most noble on the surface. Cleverness is so often employed in the service of folly, as you observed." Miss Marple's reflections. As evening approached on that anniversary day, Miss Marple settled by her fire with her knitting, contemplating the lessons embedded in the tragedy that had unfolded exactly 1 year before. The case had demonstrated once again that murder rarely emerged from simple motives or clear-cut circumstances. Instead, it grew from the complex intersection of human emotions, past injustices, and the dangerous conviction that moral rules could be suspended in service of a greater good. "The most dangerous murders," she had told Inspector Craddock during the investigation, "are often those committed from the noblest motives. Love, justice, protection, such powerful emotions can drive even good people to terrible acts when they lose sight of moral boundaries." Dr. Hartwell's transformation from healer to killer illustrated the treacherous path that could be traveled when good intentions became divorced from moral restraint. He had begun as a good man who allowed himself one very bad exception, telling himself the rules might be bent for a higher purpose. But once one made that exception, it became easier to do so again, each crime necessitating the next to maintain the deception. The eternal pattern. What remained with the villagers, long after newspaper interest had faded, was not the mechanism of murder, but the uncomfortable realization that a respected figure, driven by what he took for righteousness, had committed real evil with a clear conscience. It altered the way they spoke of motives thereafter. Phrases like, "he meant well," were no longer permitted to close an argument so easily. Yet, as Miss Marple well knew, human nature did not change simply because people had been frightened by one extreme instance of its contradictions. The vicar's new curate appeared, young and enthusiastic, quite certain that all criminal behavior could be corrected by improved environment and education. Life, in all its untidy variety, went on, carrying within it the same eternal capacity for both great kindness and terrible cruelty. The frost outside her window began to melt in the warmth of the morning sun, but the lessons learned from that terrible December morning would remain forever etched in the collective memory of all who had witnessed the transformation of a simple journey into a stage for carefully planned murder. The winter frost coach continued its daily run, carrying new passengers oblivious to its dark history, yet serving as a silent reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary life lay depths of human complexity that could surprise and shock even the most experienced observers of human nature. Miss Marple's gentle wisdom and unwavering compassion remained vigilant, ready to illuminate the darkest corners of human motivation whenever circumstances required her particular gifts. For fashions changed and methods altered, but human nature, as she knew better than anyone, remained a pattern as enduring and as endlessly variable as the frost on a winter window pane or the fine tangled threads in an old lady's basket of knitting wool.